Just as I mentioned on the original, the segment on the Iran crisis of 1946 itself begins at the timestamp 1 hour 8 minutes, but a lot of the context is lost without seeing the previous history of foreign powers in Tabriz. Thank you so much for watching. Now here's the full remastered documentary. For 40 years, the Cold War saw local populations often jockeyed over by America and the Soviet Union, along with their respective ideological spheres.
As the mountainous zone near the city of Tabriz changed hands throughout the 18 and 1900s, the ethnically and religiously diverse area found itself part of the great game between major powers, and eventually became part of the ultimate great game, the Cold War. After a short-lived honeymoon effect following the Second World War, it became suddenly crystal clear that the victorious powers no longer considered themselves allies. The games they would play in Tabriz would set the stage for the region's future turmoil, while also making the opening moves of the Cold War. It's the Iran crisis of 1946.
To understand what happened in 1946 and why it happened, we have to go back further and fully look at the history and the ethnic makeup of the region surrounding Tabriz. Most of the region was known as Iranian Azerbaijan and had a majority Azeri population, a Shia Turkic-speaking community dominating the Caspian coast, while further inland there was a Kurdish majority in the cross-border region with Ottoman Iraq. There were also some pockets of Armenian Christian majorities. The Sunni Kurds and the Christian Armenians were those most hostile to the Persian regime in Tehran. The Azeris certainly had their differences with the ethnic Persians, but both communities were Shia Muslim, and Persia's ruling dynasty was an Azeri Turkic family. In the early 19th century, Persia and Russia engaged in a series of wars over the South Caucasus, which would determine the region's future boundaries for years to come. Both wars would end with a decisive Russian victory. By the end of February 1828, the Russians had invaded Persia and surrounded their second city of Tabriz. On the 21st, the Russian general Prince Aristov issued an ultimatum to the Persians, demanding their surrender and to sign a peace treaty favoring Russia. During the war, the Russians had occupied Christian Armenia, and the treaty demanded the cessation of this territory to the Russian Empire. It also allowed for anyone, especially ethnic Russians, living in the occupied areas to be given back, including the city of Tabriz, to simply leave Iran completely and instead settle in the new Russian-controlled areas of Armenia. The treaty also gave the Talish homeland, occupied by Russia during the war, to the Russian Tsardom. Over the next 75 years, the Turkic-Azeri Qajar dynasty, which had the seat of its crown prince in Tabriz, embarked on a program of modernization and, in Tabriz especially, Enlightenment thought. However, the increasingly corrupt dynasty failed to gain popular legitimacy, exacerbated by an 1895 Cossack mutiny and a succession crisis the next year. By 1900, the Persian population, especially the Azeris and Kurds of the northwest, were fed up with the corruption and hedonism of the Qajar dynasty, and especially that of the sitting Shah, Mozaffar ad-Din, who that year took the first of his 3 trips to Europe on taxpayer dime, paid for by loans from the Russian Empire. By late 1905, the population was feeling the full weight of the foreign debt. Throughout November, street protests took place, many of them by merchants selling in the bazaars of Tabriz and Tehran. About a month later, 2 Tehran merchants were punished for charging exorbitant prices. They claimed to have charged those high prices due to the high taxes, which forced them to give away much of their revenue. As their punishment, the merchants were caned on the feet in public. The rest of the merchant community in Tehran, Tabriz, and many other cities around Persia was sympathetic to their brethren and looked to take advantage of the Shah's relative unpopularity. Tehran's Shia clerics were also in support of the cause, in line with an agreement they'd made 13 years earlier with the merchants of the city to come together in instances of overreach by the central government. This turned into protests in cities across the country in the early days of 1906, and in the Enlightenment-minded, more multi-ethnic Northwest, these took on an almost revolutionary character, with Tabriz being the hotbed for violence among those agitating for reforms.
With the Russians having virtually puppetized the Shah's regime, the British opposed the regime through support of the constitutional movement. With British backing, the protests increased in profile and more religious figures got involved. Eventually, the Shah relented
and agreed to fire his prime minister and cabinet,
and submit to some sort of assembly of justice of the people.
which would turn out to be a parliament. And although this was not implemented yet, it was still a significant concession by the Shah. Later that year, the Ottoman Empire would look to take advantage of the weakening Persian state by exploiting Kurdish divisions within Persian territory. The Ottomans then used Kurdish troops within their own legions to invade the area and attempted to force the local Kurdish chiefs to swear allegiance to the Ottoman Sultan.
By just a week later, at the end of May, the Ottomans had seized the territory surrounding the city of Urmia and had made another deep advance into Persian-controlled Kurdistan.
By the summer, on and off protesting was beginning again in major cities including Tabriz and Tehran. Meanwhile, the Ottomans consolidated their gains in Kurdistan and began occupying and annexing immediately territories beyond just the main Kurdish areas, some of which included majority Farsi-speaking populations as well as majority Azeri areas. In July, another large-scale mass strike took place, again mainly in Tabriz, Tehran, and across the country in cities, this time calling for the election of a Persian parliament.
As protesters were constantly getting in day-to-day scuffles with the Shah's security forces, for this mass protest, those clergy and merchants demonstrating in Tehran camped out on the sweeping lawns of the British embassy,
having faith that Britain would not take action against them given their clandestine support earlier in the year.
This turned out to be a good gamble, as the British continued to support the constitutional revolutionaries, and the strike continued into August.
These Basti, or asylum seekers, maintained their position camped out at the British embassy for 2 weeks.
Now, even though a lot of this was going on in Tehran, it's important to remember that many of the forces driving this constitutional push were based in Tabriz. That being said, the Tehran protests swelled to a large enough size to force the Shah's hand. By August 5th, over 12,000 people had joined in the protests on and around the British consulate. In the face of such opposition, and especially in light of their foreign support, the Shah relented and agreed to allow the protesters to write a constitution and open a parliament. After weeks of Persian requests to the Ottoman commanders to get out, the Ottomans stepped up their activities on August 24th, occupying the regional center of Urmia
and annexing it, along with its local surrounding polities, into the Ottoman Empire.
However, again, the opposition Kurdish groups not favored by the Turks went to the Russians for help, agreeing to work on behalf of the Tsar to get their local domain back, both from their regional rivals and from the Ottomans.
It was clear that the Russians were going to continue to use the Persian monarchy to do business in Iran,
as opposed to annexing territory in the way the Ottomans were doing. On September 9th, the election laws were formulated. These laws did exclude several groups, including women, from voting. However, many of the provisions were standard fare of the time. The bigger question about the parliament was whether it would turn into a rubber stamp assembly like the Russian Duma that Tsar Nicholas II had neutralized. But at this point, the Shah, having given in, allowed the opposition leaders significant input in writing the constitution.
Finally, on October 7th, the Shah opened the parliament,
a day most of its members hoped would mark the end of the turmoil. After all, this was a historic day in the history of Persia. For the first time, an elected body was in place alongside the Shah. The body reviewed the rest of the constitution, made minor changes including adding a second House of Parliament, and then had it approved by the Shah, who enacted the constitution on December 30th, 1906.
The Constitutionalist tricolor banner, with its specifically defined unique shape and its specifically defined pale colors, became the new state flag. However, Mozaffar ad-Din shockingly passed away on January 3rd, 1907.
As weak as he had been in the face of the European powers, he'd managed to hold the country together, and his well-timed compromise got the striking merchants back to work, bringing the turmoil to a close in a constructive manner. Now everything was up in the air.
The heir to the throne was the crown prince, Muhammad Ali of Qajar, and although by tradition he lived in Tabriz, he did not agree with these social movements taking place in the multi-ethnic city at this time. This despite the fact that the House of Qajar was of Turkic origin. But remember that the constitutional movement did include Persians as well, and was mainly driven by the merchant and clerical classes, certainly led by those of Tabriz and other northern cities, but also to an extent in the home of the parliament itself, Tehran. The new Shah received his coronation on January 21st, 1907. Remember, when we speak of Turkic origin in this context, we're mainly talking about the Turkic Shia population in Persia, such as the Qajar dynasty or the Azeri population. However, the Ottoman Turks were Sunni, and in fact they proclaimed to be the only legitimate Sunni caliphate in the world, with the Ottoman Sultan designated the caliph of all Sunni Islam. This is why, as they saw both themselves and Persia weakening, the Ottoman Empire decided to strengthen its position in Persia by claiming sovereignty over the Iranian Kurds. The Ottomans would expand their presence, moving into the areas south and east of Urmia within the first weeks of August. In addition to their other justifications for their involvement in Kurdistan, the Ottomans now added the reasoning that this particular bit of land had only become part of Persia during an 1821 war, and that the Ottoman annexation of all of Kurdistan was some form of payback.
Of the external players in Persia, Britain was in the weakest position. It was supporting the Tabriz revolutionaries while opposing both the Russians, who backed the Shah, and the Ottomans, who were encroaching on the Tabriz corridor, where much of the British-backed movement was based. Ultimately, the British decided that the Ottoman Empire was the bigger threat. The British went to St. Petersburg to sign a convention at the end of August. This ended the half-century-long rivalry between the British and Russian empires, and brought Russia and Britain in line against the Ottoman Empire. The convention was the result of a compromise, in which both Russia and Britain would support the Shah's government, and granting the Shah unimpeded rule over the center portion of the country. However, the Russians were given domain over most of the affairs of the north and northwest part of the country, while the British exerted a sphere of influence over the southern portion of the Shah's realm. This, of course, meant resource rights, although no oil was discovered yet, and the ability to use their army in those areas should the need arise.
The same day, without the knowledge of the pact yet, Prime Minister Mirza Ali Ashgar was assassinated outside the parliament building.
Ali Ashgar had made himself many enemies in the country, but he had a good reputation for getting things done, and had been invited back by the Shah in the wake of the constitutional crisis. He'd already made progress in negotiations with the Ottomans at the time of his death, and even after his death they ceased their advance. However, this left an opening for the Shah to appoint a new loyalist to the post of Prime Minister. The Parliament was able to oust his nominee within a month, and get the Shah to nominate their choice for the post on October 27th.
On November 12th, the Parliament forced the Shah to swear allegiance to the Parliament body,
and declared that the people and Parliament granted the Shah's legitimacy. However, the constitutionalists were in for a rude surprise. Now that the British were no longer backing them, the Shah had a free hand to deal with them however he liked. Well, it turned out the new Shah did not like this parliament. The monarch summoned his ministers on December 17th, allegedly for a special meeting of cabinet. However, when they showed up, the Shah ordered their arrest. The entire cabinet was detained, although the Prime Minister Nasir al-Mulk was set free after a short while. His government, however, was done, and the Shah himself appointed an entirely new cabinet, made up mainly of his loyalists. And while keeping the parliament's three colors, the Shah changed the flag to a design more resembling traditional Qajar flags.
Meanwhile, rebels backing the parliament had taken over half of the city of Tehran. Tabriz and Rasht in the north sent reinforcements to help. However, these and the initial uprising were crushed on December 22nd by the Shah's forces.
In the northwest, the Ottomans took advantage of the dysfunction to seize more territory.
The Shah declared the constitution to be null and void, He claimed it to be contrary to Islamic law, which gave the ruling family the right to the throne that they had won centuries earlier. The Shah attempted to dissolve the parliament, but for now it remained intact, although neutered by the Shah's authoritarian tendencies. Meanwhile, the need for security for the Shah grew as an attempt on his life was made in February 1908. Throughout the early part of 1908, the Shah's court began to bribe the Cossack brigades with the promise of total control over the city of Tehran. Meanwhile, the parliament and the merchants simply saw the Cossacks as another agent of Russian influence in the country. By the summer, the Cossacks were sufficiently loyal for the Shah to launch another attack on the already weakened parliament. The Cossack brigades under the command of Vladimir Lyakov instituted a siege of the parliament building, shelling it from all sides, executing parliamentary leaders, and then entering the remains of the defeated parliament building to burn and plunder it. As promised, the Cossacks now took full control over the capital region. Meanwhile, Tabriz simmered, with the constitutionalists unable to do anything for the moment. The Shah set up a military and economic blockade of Tabriz as an extra precaution. By February of the next year, the city had become a magnet for constitutional revolutionary fighters. The revolutionaries also swamped the city of Rasht along the Caspian coast. Both cities became hotbeds of insurrectionary activity, with Tabriz being kept under the closest supervision from the Shah's troops, from the Persian Cossacks, and from the Russian Cossacks in Russian Empire, who had their eye on securing the Shah's power in Persia. The Russians did, however, attempt to mediate between both sides to end the turmoil. The parliament attempted to assert its control over the budget, and it reached out to hire American financier William Schuster. Schuster was appointed Persia's treasurer general and attempted to support the revolutionaries through his financial policies. Thus, he drew the ire of not only the Shah, but also of Britain and Russia, who were concerned that Schuster's presence was helping to undermine the Shah's authority. The Russians pressured Persia to quell the revolutionaries and get Schuster out. The Shah sent Muhammad Vali Kalatbari Tonakabani, an ethnic Persian nobleman, to lead the Persian forces around Tabriz and crush the rebellion by whatever means necessary. However, when he got to Tabriz, the Kalatbari prince sympathized with the constitutionalists. He refused to fight the constitutional forces, saying that to do so would be to start a civil war and would be considered fratricide. So instead, he rallied the rebel forces to his cause, and in March became their leader. If there was going to be fratricide, he wanted to side with what he saw as a just cause. This in itself amounted to a bit of a declaration of civil war, as the revolutionaries attempted to begin not only building their army, but recruiting the Shah's soldiers onto their side. Once they had enough men, they took control of the city administrations of both Tabriz and Rasht, expelling the Shah's representatives as the blockades of both cities by the government continued. However, these blockades were now effectively sieges, with the constitutional forces having seized the government in both cities, effectively creating a rival government. And once again, this was not along ethnic lines, as many Azeris, some of whom shared bloodlines with the Qajar dynasty, were part of the revolutionaries, yet their goal was not Azeri separatism, and many Persians were participating as well, along with Kurds. Their goal here was a new Persian state, not a separate Azeri state. None of those distinctions really mattered to the Russians. All they saw was that the Shah had failed embarrassingly to quell the uprising, and in fact had watched the Shah's representatives switch sides and turn the protesters into revolutionaries. This could not have been seen as a bigger failure by the Russians, and they were now out of patience with the Shah's regime. Another American who was in Persia at the time, missionary Howard Baskerville, who was in Tabriz, was killed by artillery fire from the Shah's troops on April 19th. Baskerville, who was only 24 when he died fighting alongside the constitutional revolutionaries, is still revered as a patriot of democracy by Iranians even today. Baskerville's legacy was invoked even during the 1979 Islamic Revolution by Iranians attempting to contrast the American foreign policy they perceived existed during Baskerville's time against the American foreign policy they perceived existed in 1979. Russia, of course, had been granted the right to act in northern Iran in the 1907 convention with Britain.
Russia decided to exercise these rights. The Russians invaded Persia from the north with the intent to occupy Tabriz and possibly Rasht. The plan for what to do after the occupation was also not set in stone. All St. Petersburg knew is that they wanted Russian troops in Tabriz and as fast as possible. On April 29th, the Russians under General Snarsky occupied Tabriz. Remember, the Russians had jurisdiction over everything that happened in northern Iran under the 1907 agreement with Britain. Thus, they decided to keep their troops in control of northwest Persia as a bulwark against the Ottomans, and also as a potential jumping-off point for future operations within Persia. By July 9th, the parliamentary armies of Sattar Khan and Bakir Khan had met up, and the Persian constitutional government was threatening Tehran. The Russians again took matters into their own hands and threatened the revolutionaries with the introduction of more Russian troops. Those troops began arriving from Baku the next day with the intent of occupying Gilan and starving the revolutionaries of another home base. However, this would have little bearing on the outcome of the final showdown between the revolutionaries and the Shah's army in Tehran. General Lyakov had now taken personal control of the Cossack brigades and commanded on behalf of the Shah's government. Meanwhile, the combined forces of Sattar Khan and Bakir Khan were led by the Kalatbari prince, who refused the Russians' ultimatum and proceeded with the siege of Tehran. By the 13th, although the Russians had captured much of their home base by the Caspian Sea, the revolutionaries had taken control of Tehran and forced the Shah's troops to surrender. Lyakov, meanwhile, hid along with loyalists in the Russian embassy in Tehran and wouldn't officially surrender for another 2 months. By July 16th, the battle was over. The constitutionalists had won, and they had put the Shah's son, the 11-year-old